Next up, we have Matt LaGanke. I think it's stock low, split win. Gotta let your song play.
Yeah. See if there's any wrestling fans in the room. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt LaGanke. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Today, I'm excited to take you through a new flavor of a stocking density study that we conducted, looking at how different trigger densities, trigger meaning the density that prompts you to split or thin your oysters, can affect yield, shape, labor, gear, and your wallet. So, as the farmers in the room know, managing density is critical in oyster farming. It's one of the main levers you have to control growth, shape, and overall product quality. Typical approach is to start at a low density, let the oysters grow, and then split across more baskets, bringing them back down to a lower density. So that is, of course, if you don't initially stock at your final grow out density. In this picture, you can see that the farmers pulled their bags around 40% full, aka their trigger density in this case. But really, why is it important for your wallet? Well, Kayla Gilson and a fellow grad student at VIMS collected preliminary data across 12 farms in Virginia and Florida, and she illustrated that splitting and tumbling, which are in the yellow and blue, green and blue, 23% and 38%, are the biggest husbandry costs on many farms, meaning that you'll probably spend more time splitting and tumbling than any other task on the farm. So thus, we should really understand these trade-offs. So what happens if you miss the intended 40% trigger density? You get busy with other tasks, growth gets out of your, gets away from you or whatever. And next thing you know, your bags are stuffed. So previous studies have shown that lower stocking densities oysters with stocked at lower stocking densities tend to grow faster, better meat yields, and survive better. But in these previous studies, oysters were initially stocked at different densities and then compared after growing at a later date where these densities were relatively the same compared to when they initially stocked them. But as we know, and as that 80-pound bag in the last slide showed, even if you initially stock at a low density and leave your oysters in there long enough, they'll pack in tight and hit really high densities. So what happens then? Like what are the costs or benefits of playing your cards differently? What are the consequences if you miss an intended trigger density, either splitting too early or more likely splitting too late? Maybe it's less about how you start than how they finish. So in this study, we conducted a farm scale experiment in the flip farm system at VIMS to examine the effects and trade-offs of 3 trigger densities, 25%, 50%, and 75% on market yield, survival, labor, and gear, and then the final product attributes. I'll refer to these as green, yellow, and red, and also we controlled for initial density in this study. So each time a treatment reaches its trigger density, the oysters are restocked across more baskets back at that initial density. And it's really not rocket science to understand that if you split at 25%, you're going to produce 2.5 baskets, 50%, 5 baskets, 75%, 7.5 baskets. But then the question becomes when or how often will we split each treatment? What happens as oysters grow and stocking density changes over time? So getting into the methods, deployment, maintenance, and triggering splits, we deployed just under 40,000 1-inch oysters on April 13th on the VIMS research farm. This was in the flip farm line, as I said, across 3 different lines. These were randomized in blocks of 3 and air dried weekly. The farm manager kept an eye on them, and when the average density reached the specified trigger, all oysters from that treatment were removed and processed. So for processing, all oysters for that treatment were pooled by line. They were tumble, graded, and then we subsampled through weight count relationships just to get an understanding of survival and the growth for each size class. And then those the same day were restocked back out onto the flip farm across more baskets respective to the line of which they came off of. So we deployed on April 13th. The final split was June 11th, which was a year and 2 months. And that final split was forced due to elevated mortalities that we observed due to disease. Later figured out was due to disease. And then we took oysters from that final split from each treatment and conducted some condition analysis to assess these market attributes. So just to get you familiar, we tried to replicate this as best as a farm would go through their growing process. So everything was measured in terms of the size class it fell out of on the tumbler. Here we have size class 2 through 6, and we deployed everything at a size 3, and harvest size, which is around 2.5 to 3 inches, was a 6, fell at the biggest tube. So getting into the results, first want to show you all the splits that we incurred. There's a bunch of graphs on the next slide, so I'm just going to get you familiar with what what those graphs will look like. Everything will have the same y-axis, same x-axis. You have tumbler grade on the x and the estimated number of oysters from our subsamples on the y. And again, we deployed at size of 3 and harvest was 6. So this is for the green. We split 3 times, and before the fourth and final split on June 11th. And as you can see, there's kind of an interesting trend from deployment to split 1. They hit their trigger density, but they didn't move up in size class. Split 2 to 3, you see the same thing. Moving on to the yellow, you saw that first same trend between the deployment and the first split, but then after that, things progressed through the tumbler size classes. And we did 2 splits for that one, and the final one, red, we only split once. It only reached 75% once in the trigger density. And also, just to note, for Flip Farm, 75% is really hard to air dry when they're that heavy. They're all tombstoning, just like sticking straight up in the air. We tried our best to level them out, but so these were all processed on different dates. This was a function of when they hit their trigger density. So just to take you through when that happened, April 13th, we deployed. The first split for each of them all came in June of that year, within a week of each other. So they were really growing fast. They were small. Split 2 and 3 for green were next. That came in July and then September. So back to back for green. And then we had one more split of yellow in October. And then nothing reached its trigger density until the final split, the fourth and final split, when the green was around 25%, but still not quite there. And so, yeah, for that final split, as I said earlier, we pulled 90 size 6 oysters, market oysters, and conducted some condition stuff on them in the lab. So getting into some more results, what are the market? How many markets did we get? Market yield. So you have percentage on your Y, you have trigger density, the treatments on your X. We see a pretty linear trend, downward trend from 25% to 75%. So what does this percentage means in terms of the number of oysters that we saw? Well, since this was a farm scale study, we tried to extrapolate up to something that was commercially relevant. So if you're growing 1 million oysters, you had 440,000 in green, 371,000 in yellow, and 309,000 in red. And quick math, it's roughly 130,000 difference between green and red. So pretty substantial difference there. Forward. Oh yeah, I just want to tip the hat to our farm managers, Jordan Lynch, who's now at Key Allegra Oyster Co., and Madeline Pitzenbarger for taking care of these. And we were really impressed for the first crop that came out of the Flip Farm system. It was impressive. Deep cups, beautiful, really, uniform in size. So looking at the survival, we see basically the same trend as we did with market yield. And this also incorporates those oysters that made it to the market size, but then also the other size classes 5 and 4. So again, if we're extrapolating up to 1 million oysters, we got about 600,000 that survived in green, 510,000, 429,000 in red, with a bigger difference of about 160,000 between red and green there. But then we also track gear and labor, which is, it's interesting to see, like, okay, maybe you get more oysters surviving, growing to market yield or growing to market size, but that comes at a cost. So these are the total number of baskets that we use for this, and then also the total man hours worked. This includes the subsampling and all the processing, but they were pretty much the same through each trigger. Thank you. And so again, extrapolating up to 1 million, we have about 6,000 baskets for green, 5,000 baskets for yellow, 1,700 baskets for red. And then applying labor at $20 an hour, that's about $71,000 in labor for green, 60,000 in yellow, and 31,000 in red. And we also getting into the market oyster attributes. So in these three graphs on your left, you have shell height. In the middle is shell length, which is the width of the top shell. And then you have shell width, as scientific terms, I tell you. Shell width is really the depth of the oyster on the right. And so the only significant difference we saw was in shell length, shell height. And the red were actually significantly taller or higher than the green. And there could be a few instances of why this happened. First, we tumbled green more often, so we chipped the leading shell. But also flip farm, we were air drying every week, so they had more room to jostle around and also have their leading edge chipped. And then going into the derived characteristics, so for shell cup, we saw a significantly larger shell cup for green than red, but we saw no differences with shell fan and dry tissue weight. Shell fan, everyone knows what shell cup is. Shell fan is just the length over the width, so basically how that ratio. And while we see some differences in this, another tip of the hat to flip farm system, these effect sizes are relatively small, but something to consider if you're deciding which strategy to go with. And so lastly, we tried to throw some numbers at this whole process. So I'm just going to take you through this really quick because I want some time for questions. But we have seed price 22,000 for $1 million. We applied the market yield. We set everything at a 50 cent per oyster. What you get at market, labor costs, fuel costs. This is based on the VIM setup. So this is strictly our situation. Post-harvest costs I got from some local oyster farms, the total costs, the profit, and then with future earnings. So for the profit, that's everything we collected in that 1 year and 2 month period. Also, the total costs included a 7-year annualized depreciation value for the flip farm baskets. And then with future earnings, we also thought, okay, what about the ones that survived but didn't make it to market? So we applied those same percentages and ratios of survival and market yield to those. And we get green came out on top with about 119,000 in profit if you're growing 1 million oysters. Red was second with $99,000, and yellow was $89,000. And I just want to touch on this really quick because, okay, what if we standardize the size of the farm to the number of unique baskets that you have? So in this study, yellow was actually, it used the most baskets. So we standardized everything to have the same number of baskets and basically threw a crop in there and gave it all the same percentages. And although we see higher market yield and survival in green, maybe those costs are offsetting with if you're growing at 75%. Now there are a bunch of caveats to this, like there are higher stocking densities. We also saw the disease affect those more prolifically, and yeah, so it's more stress on your gear. Splitting at 75%. I mean, they're 12-kilogram baskets, 25 pounds versus a 8-pound bag. So a lot to still consider there, even though the money kind of has an interesting story. So I'm going to leave these up here and kind of take questions. My next steps are to perform a sensitivity analysis to create a kind of a trigger calculator for growers to help inform your decisions. This is also just for the flip farm system, but open to talking about research opportunities for testing in other systems. So just thank you for Bill for allowing me to do this study, and I'll take any questions.
All right. Thanks, Matt. We have time for a question for Matt.
It's less of a question, more of a comment. Flip farm has not been widely adopted, especially in the Gulf, typically out of fear of the high wave action. But generically, everyone understands it's a labor-saving investment. And so what I find very interesting about your analysis is the big delta in labor between the stocking densities. And I wonder how much that would be amplified when you're looking at it in, say, an oyster grow or a Ketchum system where the labor costs are significantly higher.
Sure. It's an interesting comment. The processing, we tumbled everything like you would for an oyster grow cage. Really the labor saving was on the air drying, which we didn't measure for this particular study. And then we restocked everything kind of just like you normally would with oyster grow. I'm trying to think of some differences.
So,
it was also,
Matt, to clarify, the labor was really in terms of the sorting and the tumbling on land.
Correct. Yeah.
Not the flipping of the flip farm.
Not the flipping. Yep. Correct.
One more question.
So yellow and red are more acidic.
Sure. Sure. We were really impressed with the oysters that we came out. We had to label all the buckets and everything to make sure we didn't mix anything up because it was really hard to tell oysters that came out of one treatment for another treatment for another treatment. So yeah, we saw really nice oysters from all three.
All right. Matt's going to be around. We're going to have to move on because we're running a little over time, but thank you again, Matt. Leslie Sturmer's up next.